is a copy of the book, and actually, before I kind of start with the thoughts that I had, I just want to point out, Alana, I love the "We Can Do It" poster you have in the background there, and it made me think about something I write about in the book, which is that well, first of all, just that poster and that phrase, right? "We can do it," is an empowering message. It's an uplifting message. It's one that gets people excited to take action. And that a World War II era poster reminds me of one of the examples of community action that we may not think about often was during World War II, when 20 million Americans turned their backyards and their front yards into victory gardens, where they were growing vegetables to help with the war effort and to support people in their community with food. And so you actually had 40% of America's vegetables being grown in people's backyards. 40% of America's vegetables being grown in people's backyards. And that's the type of community engagement that's possible when people can get behind a unified message. And I think that that's possible again as it comes to climate change. And so that's sort of, I think, a pretty good metaphor for the theme of the book. But first, I'll just start out by telling you a little bit about RE-volv. So thank you, Alana, and to the team of USC Solar Ambassadors. The RE-volv Solar Ambassador Fellowship this year has over 20 universities in the program, with hundreds of students from around the country who, like the team at USC, are trained to go into the community and identify local nonprofits that could benefit from solar energy. And then RE-volv provides the financing for those solar energy projects, such that the nonprofits can go solar for no money up front and start saving money right away. And as they pay RE-volv back over time, that money goes into a revolving fund that helps to pay for more and more solar projects in communities around the country. And of course, with each project that we build, we educate and engage the community to raise awareness about sustainability and clean energy policy at that level that they can get involved in and help to advocate for additional clean energy. So, I'm honored to be here. Happy that you guys, sort of put this event together. This is really exciting, and I'm looking forward to meeting and hearing what the other panelists' thoughts are. But I'll sort of take the next few minutes and just give you a little bit of an overview of the book, and kind of what it's about. So it's called Climate Courage: How Tackling Climate Change Can Build Community, Transform the Economy, and Bridge the Political Divide in America. And I think that the reason I wrote Climate Courage is to sort of tell a new narrative about climate change. I think that we tend to think that America is very divided on climate change, that Republicans and Democrats, that there's no middle ground, and that things are sort of at a standstill. And that's not true. That's not the case. What's actually happening is that 2/3 of Americans are concerned about climate change. And actually 85% of Americans agree that we all want to see 100% renewable energy, right? 85% of Americans want 100% renewable energy in their area. Think about that for a moment. How many things do 85% of Americans agree on these days, right? Like, not a lot. We can't even all agree to wear masks, right? Like during a pandemic. And yet 85% of Americans believe that 100% clean energy is a good thing. And so it's not that we're not seeing eye to eye on the solutions or even the problem. The truth is that that narrative isn't being told. what we see is we see politicians and we see the media sort of painting this very partisan divide, that this is it's this contentious issue, and you know, it's split down the middle, which is not true. And so the problem that actually, you know, Catherine Hayhoe, my friend and colleague, professor at Texas Tech University and climate change communicator who wrote the foreword of Climate Courage, she points out that 2/3 of Americans say that they never talk about climate change. 2/3 of Americans never talk about it. It's as if it's like money or religion. It's like this, you know, taboo subject you're not supposed to talk about. 3/4 of Americans say they never hear about it in the media, right? 3/4 of Americans say they never hear about it in the media. So what that tells me is that Americans are actually more on board with climate solutions than we perceive, mostly because we're just not talking about it enough. It's not in the public eye, and we don't feel that we can have a conversation about it. We feel like it's this taboo subject. And so that to me is really where we need to start. We need to get people talking about it and get it something that's on people's minds, so that we can have a conversation that bridges the divide, right? And so in order to do that, we have to take a hard look at how we've been talking about it. And I think, you know, one of the big findings for me was that the psychology research shows that the way we've been talking about climate change isn't really working, meaning that climate change messaging is often a very doom and gloom type of message, right? It's this really, really scary problem. It's going to require a tremendous amount of money and effort to solve it. Chances are slim, you know, we're out of time, and it's sort of, we're hitting this, you know, we're sort of, we're out of luck, right? And so that type of message is really scary, and people, when they're scared, tend to turn away from something. For people who already care about climate change, for people who are already involved, right? People who are on this call, when you hear about the latest piece of ice coming off a glacier, you may be inspired to, okay, I'm going to, you know, double down and do some more research, and I'm going to do what I can to solve climate change. But the majority of Americans, if you're not already invested, if you're not already there, then you see another headline about another wildfire or another hurricane. You hear about the devastating effects of climate change is happening. And rather than feeling motivated or inspired or feeling like we can solve this, empowered to take action, instead, you turn away, bury your head in the sand, or just throw your hands up and say, well, this is a big problem, but what can I do about it? I hope somebody can figure this out. I hope Joe Biden solves this for us, right? It's like, that's not how this is going to work. So we have to reframe the narrative, not to downplay how serious an issue it is, because it's the most serious issue we've ever faced. But we need to create a new narrative that's about solutions, that's about empowering people to take action in areas where they can at the community level, and point out how much momentum we have on our side. And there's a lot of good news around clean energy, and that's what I'm going to sort of tell you a little bit about right now. It also helps to know, where does this sort of false divide come from? The false divide comes from, you guessed it, it's the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry has, for decades upon decades, over 50 years actually, has poured money into coming up with these misinformation campaigns to try to divide the public. And unfortunately, it has been largely successful. However, we're starting to see cracks. You're starting to see more Republican and conservative leaders coming out in favor of climate change solutions. So for example, in the book, I talk about the second city in America to go 100% renewable energy is a town in Texas called Georgetown, Texas. And the mayor there is a conservative Republican named Dale Ross. And he didn't do it because he's a sort of climate hero. He did it because it was economically the best decision to make for his city. And so these are the types of stories that the more we can tell, the more we can help to sort of break that narrative that this is such a divided issue. And there's a reason why. The economics are fantastic. Mark Jacobson, who's an engineer professor at Stanford, has actually recently put out a textbook that kind of outlines his plan for 100% clean energy. And in that plan, he points out that when America gets to 100% renewable energy, Americans will save on average $1 trillion a year on their electricity costs, right? That $1 trillion a year back into the pockets of Americans who otherwise would be paying that money in their electricity bills. The second point is that it's going to net an additional 2 million jobs. It's going to create 2 million jobs above and beyond whatever jobs are lost as we transition away from fossil fuels. That's a pretty compelling narrative, right? Already, even though clean energy only generates about 11% of our country's energy, clean energy already employs 3 times as many people as the entire fossil fuel industry. 3 times as many people work in clean energy, right? So these are and that's only at 11%. So think about what happens as clean energy is deployed at scale. Think about how many jobs that creates. Again, just on this positive momentum, this story just came out 2 weeks ago. The International Energy Agency points out that 90% of new generation around the world in 2020 is from clean energy. Only 10% is from fossil fuels. In other words, all the new electricity power plants that were built in 2020, 90% of them around the world were clean energy. And that points to a very exciting development, which is that by 2025, clean energy will overtake coal as the largest power source in the world. That's in 5 years. And that's already happening. Okay? So it's not a question of if we're going to get to 100% renewable energy, it's a question of when. And that's where it's really exciting for people at the community level, because we can help to drive that momentum forward. And so again, I think, coming back to this idea of telling stories to sort of break this narrative and come up with a new narrative, a lot of the book, I talk about what's happening at the local communities and who are the people who are leading this that you might not think about as climate heroes. So I have a whole chapter on faith communities. There are a number of amazing organizations, groups like Interfaith Power and Light, Green the Church, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, Wisconsin Green Muslims. There are groups across faiths, across denominations that are putting climate change at the center of their missions and their activism in their community. And that's a tremendous development. Big companies are also seeing how beneficial this is, not just for their sustainability impact, but also for their bottom line. One of the examples I talk about in the book is MGM, which is one of the largest sort of casino owners in the Las Vegas Strip. They own 13 of the casinos there. A few years ago, they decided that they wanted to basically hedge their electricity bill savings by going solar. And so they put the largest contiguous rooftop solar array on one of their casinos. And it still was covering so little of their power that they had to build their own solar farm out in the desert. And the utility, NV Energy, said, well, if you're going to be generating your own power, we're going to require that you pay an $87 million exit fee from the utility in order to be 100% powered by your own solar. And they paid it, right? So in addition to whatever it cost to build that solar, they had to pay $87 million on top of that, and it still worked out for their bottom line, right? MGM, and so now when you go to Las Vegas, if you stay at any of the 13 MGM casino resorts, your stay is 100% powered by clean energy. And they made a really important point, which is to say that they have 40 million people traveling to their casinos every year, and that they want to use it to tell the story of clean energy. They want to use it to raise awareness about sustainability from all those people. So these are the kinds of examples we want to be highlighting. Another great example is Microsoft. Again, a company that everybody knows and uses. I'm sure everybody on this call has a Microsoft program going, or not if you're an Apple user. And Microsoft, as well Apple as well as Microsoft, both 100% committed to 100% renewable energy. Microsoft has gone so far as to say that by 2030, they will start reducing they will start having negative emissions each year, and that by 2050 they will have cut all of the emissions that the company has ever emitted from the time it started in the 1970s, right? And so these are, we're seeing, and the reason why I bring these up is because we're seeing the message, this new narrative coming forward from many different sectors. Sports athletes, I don't know if any of you caught it, during the World Series, GMC released a new advertisement for the all-electric Hummer, and it was endorsed by none other than LeBron James, right? And so when you have celebrity athletes, when you have major companies, when you have faith communities, when you have the military, the Department of Defense is one of the most aggressive clean energy developers in the world. When you have these groups that are typically what you wouldn't think of them as clean energy or climate, sort of heroes or revolutionaries, when these are the kind of mainstream sort of advocates for clean energy, that's when we can really start to break the narrative. And to me, I think what's most important when we talk about at the community level, what can people do? How do we empower people? To me, there's an important message about how people can take action. What the environmental movement has often sort of told everyone is there are basically two ways you can take action. One is your personal footprint, right? So use a reusable shopping bag, drive less, compost, recycle, etc. And those are all really important things to do. But it can often feel perhaps like a drop in the bucket. The other area that we're often told to take action is, well, let's hope that the federal government or the international agencies are able to solve this. So send a letter to your senator, email your congressperson, sign this petition, right? And that can also feel like my action isn't having as much of an impact as I would like. And so to me, between these two polarities of the individual level and the sort of federal level or international level, there's the community level. And at the community, we can actually do a lot because we can work with our neighbors on local solutions such that we don't feel like we're the only ones doing it, that we're actually doing it as a part of a group. And through doing that, we can also create tangible projects that have real results, and we can see the results in our community. And our community can then share those stories and those examples to the next community, and the next community, and the next community, and so on and so forth. We can create a sort of grassroots sort of momentum at the community level. And so that's what the USC Solar Ambassadors are doing, right? This team is going out and finding nonprofits in the community that we can help go solar. Another great example is the Sierra Club, their Ready for 100 campaign, where they've trained volunteers around the country to convince their local elected officials and to rally their local elected officials to commit to bringing their town, city, county, or state to 100% renewable energy. And they've been so successful that now 1/3 of Americans lives in an area that is committed to 100% renewable energy. So that's the level that's the power of community. And the last thing I'll say is, I think when it comes to climate change, one of the things that's so often overlooked is that we are oftentimes sort of driven to material consumption because of a society that advertises to us and sort of convinces us that this is the way we can live a happy life. And if there's one thing that I think we can sort of come out of this pandemic thinking about and reflecting on, is that what actually gives us happiness is community, is relationships, is the people we care about and being of service to them, and sort of taking time for ourselves, perhaps de-stressing when we can, and sort of more self-care. And so I think that this is an important part of the overall equation as well. So that's basically the book in a nutshell. I'll wrap it up there, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you, Andres. Yeah, self-care is definitely important during this pandemic. All right, so next we'll have Dr. Voss.
Hi, Elena. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to keep it relatively short so we have more time for discussion at the end. But I think my brief remarks are going to, dovetail nicely on what Andreas started out with. So Andreas was talking a lot about, overcoming political divides. And I think one of the ways we want to think about this also is from the standpoint of environmental justice, because we were really reminded again this summer in many ways, how divided our country is around race and class. And I think that environmental justice has some important perspectives about climate change that influence maybe the kind of work that one would do in local and community organizing and engagement around these issues. The first perspective that I see from environmental justice is that generally environmental justice groups think of controlling carbon dioxide pollution along with the co-pollutants that come from carbon dioxide pollution. And so for environmental justice movement and for these communities, very often, co-pollutants are the pollutants that they're concerned about, because burning fossil fuels has extremely negative health impacts. And we're understanding, the more we study, we're understanding just how bad the health impacts are, even at very small exposures, right? And these communities tend to be quite overexposed. So communities with large numbers of people of color and lower incomes tend to be exposed to a lot more traffic-related air pollution. They tend to be exposed to a lot more fossil fuel refineries and cement plants, and even obviously globally to coal-fired power, for example, and of course natural gas power as well. And so, I think that we need to think about these health impacts, right? And that as we're beginning to clean up and move to clean energy, that we can target some of the worst health impacts first and try to protect these communities, right? And that this makes important allies in these communities as well. And so, it's just something that has been controversial in a sense, because oftentimes climate policy treats all emissions of carbon dioxide as sort of equal. And there are some benefits to doing that in terms of efficiencies for reduction, but we don't get the kind of benefits to health that we might get otherwise if we don't pay attention to some of these issues of inequity. And so I just encourage you guys to be thinking about that, even at a household level. A natural gas stove, right, has emissions inside the house. These are important things to think about. Certainly in communities, we're talking about moving towards zero emission vehicles. Communities that are exposed to large traffic related air pollution are benefited by that. And so it's important to think about. The other way I think that environmental justice looks at climate change is in terms of the fact that there's going to be adaptation in the succeeding decades now, at least 20 or 30 years, we're going to be adapting to the ongoing effects of climate change. And so that we're already seeing, and that we're going to, unfortunately continue to see, right? And so obviously the costs and risks of the effects of climate change are also not borne equally, right? So again, poor communities and people of color are more likely, for example, to work in occupations that put them at greater risk for heat-related exposures, less likely to have air conditioning. Maybe in some parts of the world, in many parts of the world, more likely to be vulnerable to sea level rise and less able financially to cope with that and to cope with intensifying storms and all the kinds of things that come out of climate change. And so I think we also need to think about ways in which as we make this transition to clean energy, that we help these communities in the meantime sustain themselves in the face of increased risks of climate change. And so, maybe just a way of tying it all together would be to say that I think it's very important as we move towards renewable energy that because it is complex and there will be costs. Particularly, I mean, when you look at the electrifying the electrification of things that are not currently electrified, you have larger costs. You're also going to have costs for storage as we get a larger and larger penetration of renewables in the grid. And I think we have to be really careful that we don't let the fossil fuel industry, create some sort of false choice between clean power and affordable power. And that is very much a game book that they're playing from right now. And you see, the natural gas industry, for example, funding some groups that claim to be representing environmental justice. And you see the attempt to divide up kind of an incipient red-green coalition, right? An attempt to put a dividing line between working class folks, people of color who would otherwise embrace clean energy, and people who are really interested in the environmental benefits of clean energy, and doing that by follow the money. Where's the money headed? What kinds of misinformation is being distributed? And so maybe just the last thing to say, right, would be that I think we need to think carefully about if we, in our climate policies, if we're going to have carbon taxes or cap and trade kinds of policies. I think we also need to think about cap and dividend or tax and dividend kinds of policies, right? So that when we're making fossil fuels more expensive, we are also distributing that money to the folks who would be most immediately impacted by the increased expense of the fossil fuels, and giving money to help people make transitions in their in their housing, helping benefits from electrification and solar pass along to tenants and rental housing, and all those kinds of complex ways in which the financial support needs to flow to those who are most in need. And so, we have an increasingly economically divided society. And so climate policy could reinforce those economic divisions if we're not careful. And so I think we have to look at each climate policy very carefully in that regard. So the idea of cap and dividend, right, would be that we would increase the expense of fossil fuels, and then we'd actually return that money. The simplest proposals actually return that money as a cash benefit directly to everyone, right? And people can then make their own choices about how they invest in energy efficiency, how they make that transition in their own forms of consumption. So that's just what I wanted to share, just some thoughts about kind of the broader perspective of social equity and how we bring people together around climate policies across racial and income divides as well.
All right, great. Thank you. That's a very important reminder. Let's see. Next, we'll have Dr. Sanders.
Great. So I'm going to just share a few slides just for the purpose of discussion. I'll try to keep it brief, but I thought that a few figures might be helpful. So my name is Kelly Sanders, and I know many of you, but I'm an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And so I really look at this energy situation through the lens of the energy-water nexus. So a lot of times we're thinking about decarbonization, decreasing carbon over time, but we also have to be wary that a lot of our energy portfolio has other environmental consequences, and some of those consequences are to water systems. So our energy system is really dependent on water. our water system is very dependent on energy. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on that. And a big thing here is a constraint in one of these systems, say energy, can become a constraint in the other system, say water. And this tension is manifesting itself all over the world. And so as we decarbonize and as we adapt, we really have to think about how these resources relate to each other, because energy is kind of like mitigation. We're looking at mitigation mostly through the energy system. Adaptation is mostly through water. We're managing the hydrological cycle, more drought, more floods. So it's really important that we think about these things holistically, because sometimes mitigation does not align with adaptation. So the goal of my research, and hopefully some of the seeds that'll plant for you today, is how can we turn this relationship into a win-win rather than a lose-lose? So this is our energy portfolio, and it's important to realize, because I think a lot of times it's easy to forget, 80% of the United States energy system is still dependent on fossil fuels. So we have a lot of work to do to get to a 100% clean energy portfolio. And a lot of these energy resources are dependent on water. So whether it's oil and gas, whether it's coal-fired power plants or nuclear power plants, which require a lot of water for cooling, whether it's biomass, 10% of the gasoline that you put into your car, or the gasoline blend that you put into your car, is from corn, and that requires a lot of irrigation. Hydroelectricity obviously is dependent on water. And so the vast majority of these, so when you think about the natural gas coal plants and the nuclear power plants, are big power plants that look like this, and they're often on large bodies of water. And that's not a coincidence. They need these large bodies of water to cool themselves for operational purposes. And so this is important because most of the decarbonization the United States is talking about, the strategies are really through electrification. So we're going to be seeing a lot less power plants that look like this, and we're going to be seeing a lot more power plants that look like this. And this is a win-win situation, because as we move to solar panels and wind turbines, we de-water as we decarbonize. So we are getting a carbon mitigation benefit. We are also getting a carbon adaptation benefit. And so if we look at this portfolio again, as we decrease natural gas, coal, and nuclear, these are some of our more water thirsty technologies, and move through wind and solar, that's good news. So electrification could be good for water, as we go to some of these alternative technologies. But there's big question marks when it comes to transportation. So we are talking a lot about electric cars. Those are useful for passenger vehicles, but we still have to think about what's going to happen to aviation and freight. How are we going to heat our homes and heat our industrial processes? So we really have to think about what this next generation of clean fuels looks like from a water vulnerability perspective. And so why do we care about water? So this is a question that I get quite a bit. I think everyone in this room probably is aware of this, but the earth is not water scarce. We have a lot of water on the earth, but a lot of this water is in the wrong form. So it is locked up in ice or in water vapor. It might be in the wrong quality, so very, very dirty. It might be in the wrong location, so far away from our population centers. And so only a very, very small percentage of the water that we have access to is at a quality and in a location that's useful for us or convenient for us to tap. Now, all of these challenges can be overcome, but they can only be overcome at the expense of energy. So many of us live in Southern California. 90% of Los Angeles's water is pumped from hundreds of miles away. And so we know of this relationship quite well. And so, as I wrap up here, I just want to plant that this is already a crisis all around the world. So we see, throughout the years, we've seen situations like in Cape Town where they were very worried about running out of water, at the same time that they were very dependent on coal-fired power plants that were utilizing their very scarce water resources for cooling. We have cases in India where drought prevented farmers from having access to irrigation from surface water sources. So they went to groundwater that required a lot of energy. And so their electric grid broke. During our major hurricanes, first you lose access to electricity, then you lose access to potable water. And that's when the crisis gets really, really bad. So we really have to think about, as we move into this future of more extreme events, how could our energy system and our transitioning energy system be a little bit less vulnerable to some of the disruptions that we're already encountering? Because as we move forward, we're going to have a lot of pressures. So we have population growth, particularly in developing economies. So a big question mark is, how does Africa, for example, build out its electricity system, and how are they going to make themselves less vulnerable to some of the water disruptions that we already have in more water-rich parts of the world? Economic growth. So as we get richer, we demand more energy, we demand more water. So it's kind of this spiraling relationship. We have climate change, obviously, that is making our droughts more severe and our floods more flashy, which is creating major problems for both systems. And then we have these policy choices. In some cases, we are going towards more water-intensive energy, like in the case of biofuels. In other cases, we're going to more energy-intensive water, which could be good news, because as we get more educated, we demand cleaner and cleaner water. So there are these potential conflicts between mitigation and adaptation, which is kind of the theme that I want to leave us to think about. You know, things like desalination are good for adaptation. That's a more drought-proof source of energy, or a more source of water, but it comes at the expense of a lot of energy. Dry cooling is another example of this. But there are these potential synergies. So as we go to more wind and more solar PV, more water recycling, more energy conservation, more water conservation programs, we get these win-wins. So it's really important to think not just about decarbonization, but also, as we have this huge opportunity to build out these new systems, how can we also meet some of these adaptation goals? So with that, I'm going to stop and leave it to our other panelists, but I'm happy to take questions afterwards.
Thank you. All right, so next we'll have Dr. Bernstein.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. I actually think this was awesome in terms of the complementarity, if that's a word. I've got a doctorate, so I can make up words, right? That's what we get when we get a PhD. Andreas and Alana, thank you so much for putting this together. This is really exciting, and I feel really lucky to be invited. I am going to share my screen. Oh, can you let me do that? It's going to be really boring, but
I'll make you a co-host right now. Let's see.
Okay, let me try. It says I'm still disabled.
You should be good now.
Which is fine. No, I am now, oh boy, I'm the co-host. Who knows what will happen next? Okay, I just have a few slides. Let's see. I'm sure I need to go to hosting. Okay. Well, I guess I can't see my notes, so I guess that means I just need to use my brain. So first of all, thank you guys so much. This is really exciting. And this is my stuff. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I guess that's what we do, and stay attentive to, you know, all these things. But what I kind of wanted to talk about today, and I wasn't quite sure. So I'm doing a lot of stuff with respect to attitudes on solar development in the Mojave Desert right now. But I thought I would back up a little bit and talk a little bit about the role of community-based social marketing, because it actually seems like something that RE-volv is doing really well. And I think it's super interesting. So first of all, this is based on Doug Mackenzie Moore's work from the mid, 2000s. But the idea with community-based social marketing is, first of all, as I think everyone in this panel knows, everyone loves solar, right? And that's great and bad. Like when you survey people, everyone's like, yes, we love this. And then what happens next? That's what's more complicated. So we can have pro-environmental attitudes and values. And I think my notes, which I can't see now, which said that my PhD focused on the diversity of contemporary environmentalism and the ways in which contemporary environmentalists are very diverse. Some advocate solar, some advocate, wind, some advocate nuclear, and there's very different groups within contemporary environmentalism. But I think that, in general, when you're advocating for certain things, one thing is identifying the behavior we want changed. And in this context, it is, you all want to make folks adopt solar. So one of the things, which is great, or make nonprofits, sorry. So identifying the benefits and barriers is critical. And one of the things with social-based community marketing is that, the barriers are way bigger of a challenge than the social psychological attitudes, right? Everyone loves solar, then what? So figuring out what the barrier is the critical step. So I don't want this, this picture was kind of classic. It's like down in 29 Palms. But, so, looking at these barriers and trying to figure out what they are and figuring out how to overcome them, given the like really broad support for solar, I think is super critical. So, one is this idea of social norms and community support. And so that's something that my students and I are working on. So I work with students I have 2 undergraduate students that I've been working with for 2 different years, and we go to the Mojave and we use interdisciplinary methods to try to figure out what exactly is going on out there. And we have the biggest environmental organizations out there, Sierra Club, everyone else, and they're anti-solar. Because I think, in many ways, it patterns on historic ways in which their communities and their ecological areas have been used for the purposes of large, powerful organizations. So we need to be, and this is why I love Dustin Mulvaney's work. We need to be aware in which solar innovation can pattern historical patterns of traditional fossil-based fuel innovation and make communities, oppose them for the same reasons they opposed traditional energy innovation sources. So I think this is something we need to be really aware of and cognizant of. Again, I don't have my slides, or I don't have my notes, but so I'm just speaking off the cuff. But these things need to be visible. These projects need to be visible. They need to be engaged in communities. They need to be engaged early. And folks who are on the ground, I mean, when the Sierra Club is opposing solar innovation, we need to pay attention to why and how and the ways in that matters, you know? So that's kind of the stuff I'm interested in. You know, I do spatial science, but I'm very interested in the social science side of things. And I think that, you know, as the solar ambassadors, which I think is awesome, you know, I love this concept of solar. And I also think that the RE-volv stuff, from what I've seen, is amazing in terms of, you guys saw the barriers. The barriers are financing. So great, you're going over those barriers, because that's the thing with social psychology. It's not, you know, what do we want to do? It's what's keeping us from doing what we want to do. So the financial stuff that this organization has done, from what I can see, is amazing. I just think, like, you know, looking out into these communities and seeing, I mean, you know, in the desert, in the Mojave, which is the area in which myself and my students study, they have been for 100 years subjected to a bunch of people from the city coming out and thinking they have some great idea, and then it doesn't work out. So why would they accept one other great idea in their backyard, you know, that's gonna decrease their property value? You know, we all love solar, but so anyways, oh, I'm gonna go to, I'm gonna go to my slide. So these, I'm just gonna brag about my students for a little bit. So my student on the upper left, this is my student Charmaine Dallasay, and she's awesome. And she and I went out, we did a field trip. She did a combination of spatial analysis and attitudinal stuff. So we did interviews, we did surveys, we did all kinds of stuff. We went out to Bombay Beach Estates, which again is like 50 years ago. This was supposed to be the boom town on the Salton Sea. And guess what happened? Now it's this weird, cool, everyone should go there. Like, seriously, go there. But it's wait a second, I can't see my thing anymore. I don't know if you guys can either. I will try to reshare. So, you know, this is the desert area in the Mojave, in which solar is still being aggressively pushed. You know, these folks have seen things like the Bombay Beach Estates. So everyone, you know, from the city comes out and has these great ideas about how whatever the vision is going to be. So I guess my bottom line is that sensitivity towards a community's historical context is really important, right? Because you can't pass these stuff off. And I don't want to say pass, you know, because again, everyone wants solar, but being really sensitive to community history and context is really critical. And then I was just gonna also, again, brag about my students, because my student Charmaine, who's in the upper left, she did a really great story map about sort of the broader context of solar development. And you know, she looked a lot at Dustin Mulvaney's book with respect to, you know, there are commodity chains involved in solar. It's not like the energy is clean, but there's a lot of social justice and broader ecological issues along the commodity chain that I think we need to be more clear and cognizant of. And then my bottom right image is my current student, who is doing, he's basically asking all the heads of community councils at every site in the Mojave to assess where they think solar would work and where it wouldn't. So we're doing sort of a community-based map, and so that's gonna be super fun. So I can stop sharing now. Let me see if there's anything I forgot. Nope, I don't think so. I don't think I did. Thank you for letting me present and get the time. This is super fun. And just in general, I don't know. This is a complex space. There's a lot of advocacy, and again, what do we do with this advocacy on the ground? I guess that would be my question.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see, next we'll have John, and I'll keep the Zoom call open after 6 p.m. for anyone who can and wants to stay after for questions.
Hi, thank you. I'll be pretty short and sweet since I know we're in a time schedule. I'll start by saying I am not a professor, and I'm also not a doctor. I am a student, but I'm also a solar developer. So I work for Cypress Creek Renewables. We develop community as well as utility scale solar projects nationwide. I had some stuff written down, and after listening to everyone speak, that's all changed. I think for me, the thing that stood out the most over everything I've heard today is the economics of all this. At the end of the day, I work for a for-profit company. We have a lot of goodwill, and everyone I work with is interested in, putting more solar into the ground. But at the end of the day, we work with balance sheets. And so I think something that I often see is somewhat of a disconnect between the wants and desires of people versus the realities of what we can actually do with solar and where we can put it. And those realities, I say again, are often tied back to the economics of this. So something that we often deal with is in community solar is we're displacing generally we find agriculture operations, and the disruption of the agriculture operation, like for example, in a small upstate New York community, it can take seasonal jobs out of the community. It can take a family out of the community because they sell their farm and their land. And we're going in with the mindset of we're doing a betterment to this community. We're giving them green power. We're giving them clean energy, taxes and stuff like that. But you have to be cognizant of the fact that you're altering the look of the community by putting a large solar plant in. You're altering the fabric community in some senses. And so I just think also, kind of carrying on with what Dr. Bernstein was speaking about is it's just very important to understand the community's needs, and if solar really is going to be a right fit in the long term, or if it's going to be a fancy showpiece that really isn't necessarily a good fit for a community. And that's coming from somebody whose job it is to put solar into the ground and develop these things. So it's something I would leave you guys with, is to understand that context, that, like you said, everyone loves solar, but then what? And that what often is for us, the question I have to answer is, how's that going to affect the community and what that community really wants from us?
Great, thank you so much. Let's see. To wrap up, let's see, we have, there was a raffle for copies of the book. I will notify the winners after. And then here's a QR code for the application to become a RE-volv Solar Ambassador at USC. And here's also the URL. But yeah, I'll open it up for questions now.
I have a question. First, I just wanted to say thank you to all the panelists. Everything that you guys said was really awesome and inspiring. I guess my question is, as a young person who is really passionate about climate justice, combating the climate crisis, and really wants to work in this space, but also has like some ethical concerns about like what kind of career choice can I have that is actually going to make a difference? What advice would you give to that kind of person?
I'll take a first crack at it, which is to say, you know, as I'm sure you know, the teammates at USC you know, can attest to, you know, one of the reasons why RE-volv has our Solar Ambassador Fellowship program is to give college students a practical hands-on experience working in the community, talking to stakeholders, seeing, you know, to John's point, if this makes sense for a particular nonprofit organization, and what the benefits are going to be. And so, you know, during the course of the year, the fellowship exposes students not just to the sales process and the contract signing, but as well as the installation and then the sort of more communications and community engagement work. And so we really try to emphasize a lot of different skill sets that are necessary to make the clean energy revolution happen. And we bring in a lot of guest speakers throughout the year. We have webinars every month to try and sort of expose people to different paths within the industry. So, you know, what I say to any folks, you know, that are looking to get into the space is that we're at the very beginning of what's going to be, I mean, as the International Energy Agency pointed out, by 2025, there will be more clean energy generation than any other technology around the world. It's in 5 years. So we are at a transition point globally. And so the new technologies from solar and wind to batteries to grid, to microgrids, to electric vehicles, to storage, to innovative agricultural practices, to you name it, there's going to be a massive amount of, we need to rethink everything. And so within that, you know, you can have a huge impact on the climate in a number of different fields, in a number of different areas. So I would say follow your passion, you know, whatever you're interested in, you know, whatever you are reading about that gets you excited, you want to read more about it, you want to get your hands dirty doing, follow that, and there will be a pathway to use it to reduce carbon and to increase equity and social justice. I have no doubt.
So Andreas, with all due respect, when I looked in 2018, solar was 1.6 of the US's energy budget, right? According,
yeah, in terms of percentage of overall electricity, no, it's super small right now, but
I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I also would advocate us thinking about the other energy sources that are really the bulk of that energy budget and taking them seriously. Like, because we have to wrestle with those too, right? Like, you can't just advocate for solar when it's like, we can, but like, so I'd love more thoughts on that, you know, because when I saw that percentage, I was like, holy cow, you know?
Yeah, it's small. No, I mean, I would say, I mean, RE-volv is a, you know, to your point earlier, which I loved, that you know, we have to see what are the specific barriers and how do we address that. And so the idea behind RE-volv, you know, really was, how do we empower people to fight climate change, which is what I think is the real question that I'm trying to solve, right? How do we get people the sense of agency that we're not, you know, sort of, you know, actors that don't have a role to play, that we all can have a role to play. And so the solution that, you know, that RE-volv kind of came up with was teaching people how to bring solar to nonprofits in their community. But that being said, believe me, I'm 100% a fan of wind and water and all the other, you know, clean renewable energy technologies that are just and scalable, 100%. I personally am of the opinion, you know, that solar energy is going to outpace those other technologies as we grow. I mean, according to, again, to Mark Jacobson's you know, plan, you know, it's basically, you know, when we get to 100% clean energy, it will basically be, you know, 40 to 50% wind, 40 to 50% solar, and then a remainder is going to be other things. So wind and solar are going to be, you know, the dominant energy sources moving forward. at least at this point. But yeah, of course, I don't mean to say, so it's solar or bust, right? It's, I think students should be following whatever gives them interest, whatever is passionate, whatever sort of excites them, because there is going to be some way to contribute, in that way.
It's so interesting, Andreas, that just when you said Jacobson, I was typing the message to everybody.
Nice.
I think this book that that he published just a couple months ago now, 100% Clean Renewable Energy Storage for Everything, is a super important book, and I would recommend it to people. It's interesting, apropos our discussion today, that I think that the transition to renewable energy, as one gathers from reading his book, is of course quite complex, right? And so there are all sorts of things that have to be electrified. There's all kinds of implications of the kinds of materials that need to be used in that. We use a lot of copper, a lot of other kinds of materials. Apropos our discussion today, one of the interesting things is that he has been, that I think that in this book, as I look at it, is that it doesn't really, explore the land use impacts that we've been talking about today of the large solar installations, or the large wind installations, frankly, as much as one would like to see. It's kind of, the approach there is to say that there is damage, but the damage is not as bad as from fossil fuel sources anyway. So that's at a local scale, with their particular communities that are facing that, and also because biodiversity impacts, for example, are very different depending on where they happen, right? So like, you can't just count. What he does sort of is count the number of bird kills from wind turbines, right? And then compare that to the number of bird kills from fossil fuels. Well, they both kill birds, but where you kill the birds makes a big difference, right? And the types of birds that are killed. And so, I think there are these very complex issues with regards to land use as well in wind and solar, for example, that still do need to be worked out carefully. And so I just wanted to jump in because I think it's an important area. And so to answer to Anna's question, this is the kind of place that people might work, right? There are a number of areas in the transition to clean and renewable energy that are really not worked out yet, right? And so whatever discipline you're studying, there are ways to get ahead of that trend and work towards, what the next decade or two might look like there and solving some of those complex problems, right? So depending, a number of you students on the meeting today are probably majoring in very different things, but many of those different majors could contribute in different ways to those things. The other thing I would say to the students today about future career options here is to think also about the various ways in which climate change is stressing systems, right? And so Dr. Sanders has spoken really importantly today about water and how the water system is implicated, but there are other things too, like managed coastal retreat and all kinds of things that are going to be very important issues to be dealing with in the next decade or two. And so I think really, really fertile areas for students to make a difference from a number of different majors or kinds of graduate degrees you might explore as well.
Great, thank you.
Did anyone have any last minute questions or? All right, then thank you guys so much for participating on this panel, and thank you for everyone who came out today. I'm very glad we got to have this discussion today, and yeah, I hope everyone has a good long break.
Thank you so much, Alana, for making this happen.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Alana.
Thank you to the panelists. This was really interesting.
Take care.